In 1997, Castlevania Symphony of the Night took everything good about the 2D Castlevania franchise and pushed every concept to its logical conclusion. What a lot of people don't realise though is Symphony of the Night was a flop. This was the era of franchises moving into the third dimension. In order to stay relevant, Castlevania needed 3D games. And if you happen to have heard that the N64 Castlevania games suck, then I'm here to tell you that actually they don't. Welcome to the game show. My name is Matty, and the N64 Castlevania games are better than you thought. Konami had never been afraid of jumping into new things. In fact, Castlevania is kind of instrumental on having established Konami on basically every platform before the N64. Castlevania was going to be not only Konami's first ever N64 game, but it was going to be their first ever 3D game. If making 2D games had been considered old hat, then Konami were going to just borrow elements from all the big 3D games of the era in order to make Castlevania 64 super relevant. A Final Fantasy inspired story with 4 playable characters, Zelda-esque dungeons with treasures and unlockable items, a day and night cycle, RPG elements. Nearly all of this stuff ended up getting dropped, but Konami were going in hard on this. What we did get was 2 playable characters, Reinhard Schneider and Carrie Fernandez. Reinhard Schneider is actually a descendant of the Belmont clan, and Carrie Fernandez is related tangentially to the Belnades clan. According to the Castlevania wiki, this game is set in 1852, which weirdly puts it halfway between Symphony of the Night and the new generation, so it's kind of out of the 100-year cycle. Anyway, I'm sure it doesn't matter. Like in all Castlevania games, the opening stage is all about teaching you the rules. Castlevania 64's opening level, though, is way more atmospheric than previous games. There's a much bigger focus on exploring and platforming and puzzle solving, and that really sets the tone for what's to come. The castle is divided into all the things that you would expect from a Castlevania game. There's torture chambers, dungeons, spooky gardens. There's a lot of backtracking and puzzle solving and looking for keys and so on. There's definitely a Resident Evil influence here, but it still feels very Castlevania. The game still has sub-weapons from previous games like the dagger, the axe, the boomerang, the holy water. New to the Castlevania formula are things that were emerging in the 3D platformers of the day, like climbing and platforming. Also, certain enemies can leave Reinhard poisoned or in a vampiric state. These are just some really simple RPG-like buffs or debuff type things, but if you're turned to a vampire, Reinhard can't actually use any of the anti-vampire weapons. I think that's pretty cool. The day-night cycle is really well implemented here as well. It's where enemies will be stronger during the nighttime, but there's also whole sections that can only be completed during the day or during the night. There are in-game items called sun and moon cards, which you can play at any time, which will spin the time onto either sunrise or sunset. The first half of the game follows this non-linear Peter to Paul format, but due to rising pressure to get this game finished, the second half just falls back on that classic Castlevania gameplay of old. This is no bad thing really. We see the return of classic Castlevania enemies, there's a fight with the Grim Reaper on top of a tower, there's a clock tower, and then you're on to Dracula, whip whip whip, fantastic. 75% of your time playing the game will be spent on that first non-linear bit, with the second half of the game being something you can breeze through in a couple of hours. The only real difficulty in the second half of the game is falling off of stuff. To be fair, I'm glad to see that remains part of the Castlevania canon. The ending of the game, though, I do have to say, it is incredibly sincere. I don't want to give too much away because I actually would recommend you play this, and that's kind of my point. It can't be understated what a tremendous sea change moving to 3D really was, and Konami clearly were feeling the pinch on this. They had to drop characters, there are features that got dropped, there are whole levels of the game that are super difficult because I guess they just didn't have the time to balance them. But you know what? For a team that had never made a 3D game before, the stuff that they did get in here, they got it right. Rather than fighting against the N64's limitations, Konami did a great job of working with it. Instead of trying to cram tons of stuff on screen, Castlevania's 3D engine focuses on delivering an extremely smooth 30 FPS. Where the N64's texture buffer was a little bit muddy, Konami were making good use of coloured lighting to inject extra atmosphere. The limited graphics in fact sparked my imagination quite a bit more. By using fogging to hide the N64's low draw distance, I saw Dracula's castle as being this dusty old mansion you know, it felt very atmospheric. And I like these old 3D models, man. I think they're full of character. Finally, being a cartridge system, the N64 didn't really have incredible ability for music and audio, so the composer Masahiko Kimura opted for this extremely low-key, ominous atmosphere. It's very subtle, but it's very good. There are some concessions that we do need to make. The thing about early 3D games is the movement was really quite ice rinky in a lot of them, and Castlevania is a challenging game because of this. To be completely honest with you, a lot of the frustrations with the platforming and the difficulty can just be resolved by using a better controller and save states. I know this is technically a form of cheating, but removing the limitation and the frustration allowed me to connect directly with the vision of this game. And that vision includes skeletons riding on motorcycles. This is amazing. Castlevania launched on the N64 in January 1999, and it sold a grand total of about 640,000 copies. It got decent reviews, 7s and 8s and so on, but as far as Konami was concerned, this was not good enough. I think truthfully, had Castlevania 64 been a launch title, I think this would have been a game that people would consider one of the all-time N64 greats. But the problem is, it came out 3 years into the N64's life, and so Castlevania couldn't really stand up against the big hitters that were already around. Konami just didn't get it quite right in the time they had, but I have massive respect for this attempt. In fact, I actually have so much to say about this game that I've written a much longer script off the back of this video, so you can enjoy that here. The story doesn't end here. Konami had their engine and they had their team. They were certain if they had a little more time, then they could get it right if they just took another shot. And so nearly 1 year later, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness launches in the Christmas 1999 window. A whole new game built using the same engine, set 8 years before the first N64 game. Supposedly this game is explaining why the first game is outside of the usual 100-year sequence. This time, all 4 playable characters made it into the game. Cornell is the character on the box, and he is the only character available for your first playthrough. He is on a quest to find his kidnapped sister and something Castle Dracula. He's quick, he uses ranged attacks, and he has sub-weapons like in the first Castlevania game. What's really cool in this is the sub-weapons actually now stack, like they did in Castlevania for the NES. That already is pretty cool, but if that wasn't enough, with a little tap of the L button, he turns into an actual Wolfman. He goes Super Saiyan, he's chipping about the place, slashing everyone up. It's awesome. The opening level is a haunted old pirate ship, and this reminded me a lot of the opening level of the first God of War. Off the bat, we're off to a hell of a start. This is fantastic. For a brief period, Legacy of Darkness is pretty much the same as the first N64 Castlevania game. You go up to the mansion, you go into the maze, and then the best thing happened. The skeletons on motorcycles turn up, but this time, the motorcycles have sidecars. And what is that on there? Is that an MG42? This is absolutely amazing. I was so stunned, I didn't even fight back. I was just like, do you know what? He's won. He's won. The non-linear mansion-y bit is actually a lot shorter here than it was in the first game, and as a result, the whole experience is a lot smoother. Where Castlevania 64 settled into being more of an action game for the second half, Legacy of Darkness finds ways to continue pulling through those puzzling and those platforming elements well into the late game. Combat is present, but it's just much easier and there's much less focus on it, which does make Legacy of Darkness way more accessible than Castlevania 64, which is probably why people like it better. The climbing is also marginally better, I think. There's a whole level, in fact, of climbing up the outside of Castle Dracula. It kind of felt like a progenitor for the early Uncharted style 3D platformer. You're still fighting against weird controls in bits. Momentum feels like it's a bit of an issue. That aside, I still really liked this bit. My favourite level in the game is probably the Science Tower. I love all the cogs and the steampunk and the Isambard Kingdom Brunel giant chains. I was really enjoying running around this level looking at all this stuff, and then wow, with giant veiny penis guns. Then this section throws you through a loop and it turns into a side scroller where you're running and jumping and sliding to avoid the penis guns. Obviously Manny Calavera turns up near the end, as always. The final boss, absolutely mental. I even said out loud while I was playing it by myself in my room, I was like, wow, this is the best Dracula fight ever. Most videos on these games will say, if you're going to play one N64 Castlevania game, play Legacy of Darkness. It fixed all the problems with the first one and it's basically a remake anyway. That isn't true. To call Legacy of Darkness just a remake of Castlevania 64 does both games an injustice. It uses the same engine as the first game, but it brings a whole host of quality of life improvements. It uses the expansion pack, which means it not only has higher res textures, but the music in this is much better. Ironically, Legacy of Darkness got even lower reviews on release than Castlevania 64, despite being a slightly better game. It also only sold 130,000 copies, because when this game went to market, Konami just absolutely slashed that marketing and distribution budget. That's reality. So ends a difficult chapter in the Castlevania story. After Legacy of Darkness, there wasn't another Castlevania console game for 5 years. By the end of the 1990s, Castlevania was no longer Konami's star player. It was a bit long in the tooth, and Konami had newer, more relevant franchises. I think one of the things which hurts the legacy of these N64 games is that Symphony of the Night is such a banger. The way that these two different games turned out is almost a perfect example about how every franchise struggled to transition to 3D. Does this mean Castlevania 64 isn't worth playing? Absolutely not. If you had to put all the Castlevania games in a tier list, then yeah, they wouldn't be at the top, but nor would they be at the bottom. I really enjoyed the vision in these first two games. It just really felt like the teams were given a lot of creative freedom. They're just expressing themselves and coming up with all these crazy ideas. They are definitely better than most people on the internet claim they are, and I had a huge amount of fun making this. I'm slowly working my way through every single Castlevania game, so if you happen to be new to the channel, please go into my previous uploads. There's a ton of Castlevania content on there already. If you want to see more, then you know what to do. Thanks very much. Until next time, ta-da!